Hi there and welcome to the Byline Podcast from the Byline Times with me, Adrian Goldberg. This time, Rupert Murdoch shamed after his news group newspapers admitted to illegal activity for the first time as it settled a phone hacking case brought by Prince Harry. NGN made, and I quote, a full and unequivocal apology to the Prince after acknowledging that private investigators employed by the Sun used unlawful methods to gather information about him. NGN also said sorry for its intrusion into the private life of Harry's mum, Diana, Princess of Wales, and is thought to have paid in the region of £10 million to settle the case. They also settled with the former Labour Party deputy leader, Tom Watson. Let's talk now to the Byline Times reporter Dan Evans, top investigative journalist who, in a previous life, worked for the News of the World and has been a phone hacking whistleblower who has given evidence in the litigation against NGN. Dan, welcome. Just tell me how significant this case is, and particularly this acknowledgement by newsgroup newspapers that they used illegal methods.
Hi, Adrian. Thanks for having me. This case, it's hugely significant. It was kind of the last domino to fall, as it were, in the civil litigation, which has been dogging Rupert Murdoch's company for the last 14 years or so. So it's been a long day coming. It could have gone one or two ways. We could have either progressed into a trial at which there would have been a scrutiny of many dozens of individual specific allegations talking about not just what happened to Harry and Tom Watson, but also the activities of the company in covering up what went on its watch for many years. And of course, all that formed part of the apologies which we've heard about today.
And I think a lot of people were looking forward to hearing some of that detail unpacked in court. And I'm sure that's what lay behind the very late settlement by NGN.
There were a lot of people wanting to hear the granular detail of what went on at the Sun, who would have been disappointed by the fact that the trial was settled before it got going. However, a lot of the allegations have been aired already because this is it's a long-going litigation. It had been going on for, well over 10 years, or approaching 10 years, I should say. And during that period, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of different hearings, and at each hearing, some more information has been emerging, and then over time, that kind of gets collated into what we now refer to as the generic case of concealment and destruction, which kind of does what it says on the tin. It goes to the heart of what the company did in order to cover itself once it realized that it had been caught out with this modus operandi of essentially running its newspapers with huge criminal reliance on private investigators, invasive news gathering techniques, things like phone hacking that people have heard about in quite some detail over many years, but also, the activities of blaggers with sort of pretext blagging. It's the process of obtaining private information by deception, the use of private investigators to carry out these services. So, there were going to be quite the roll call of witnesses coming along to talk about what happened to them. Lots of expert testimony going to the technical aspects of it all. And everyone was kind of waiting for the sleeves to get rolled up and a big old courtroom punch up to start. However, we've had a different outcome.
You can understand, can't you, both from Prince Harry's point of view and from Tom Watson's point of view. I've known Tom over the years, and he's spoken to me very movingly about the pain that the intrusion into his private life has caused him. He described to me having people rummaging around the bins in the house where he used to live in the West Midlands with his then wife, and the fear that provoked in him and his children, never mind the more sophisticated methods of intrusion that were used. And I'm guessing both for Tom and for Prince Harry, although I'm sure they were both keen to have the case fully aired and for the full detail to be made public. On the other hand, to go through a full court process is in itself a very draining and emotionally tough process.
Well, it's called a trial for a reason. Of course, it is a test, not just of the evidence, but of the people giving the evidence. So, there would have been harsh cross-examination. There would have been, based on my previous experience of similar courtroom scenarios, there would have been ad hominem attacks. I think from Harry's perspective and Tom's perspective, they would have been wide open to what I refer to as cartel journalism. So while the Sun obviously won't be able to be unduly critical while it's in a court process, colleagues over at the Mail, for example, or the Mirror, for example, wouldn't be constrained by such things as offending a judge. So during Harry's previous trial against Mirror Group newspapers, which of course he resoundingly won, and of which I was a witness for the claimants, it was really notable that the coverage was incredibly waspish from elsewhere in the industry, which, as far as the public's concerned, is trying to sort of detect the reasons behind that is quite difficult. But when you realise that, of course, it's in the interests of, for example, the Mail to undermine the credibility of people who have also come forward and are also trying to bring claims against that company separately, okay? And similarly, it was Mirror in the dock last time, the Times, other kind of Murdoch stable newspapers, they played fast and loose with the very kind of, they went right to the edges of acceptable court reporting, sometimes even arguably foregoing the qualified privilege that they enjoyed through fair and balanced reporting in favour of essentially sort of doing hatchet jobs. So that kind of past experience would almost certainly have been repeated in respect of difficult negative coverage. Yes, you're absolutely right. Unfair coverage by those who have the megaphone of the media. Yes, absolutely correct. That is the MO, and that's happened before, so why wouldn't it happen again? You mentioned Tom Watson having people rummaging around in his bins, for example. Now, that level of intrusion is reserved for people who either sell a lot of newspapers on behalf of newspaper owners, so celebrities who have been built up and it's time to pull them down again, or people who pose a particular threat to the owners and the controllers of these organizations. Tom Watson is, continues to be one of those people. He was incredibly interested in the covering up of wrongdoing at News Group newspapers and elsewhere. I think he co-authored a book about it. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he got very, very special attention. And of course, the collateral damage, which nobody really sees until you have an opportunity to listen to people like Tom giving his statement outside court today, is the family, it's the friends, it's the people who are peripheral, people who are in the orbit of the target, who are also just sort of sucked in, almost like on an event horizon, inescapable attention cast upon them because of their proximity to somebody who threatens these very, very powerful organizations who do enjoy huge, enormous influence, continue to do so today, and have kind of wielded that in a really unfettered, and now we know at the Sun newspaper, through the PIs they use, unlawful way.
It was interesting, I thought, that the NGN statement acknowledged the illegal activity, but they were also very careful to lay it off to the private investigators, as if to put some distance between the Sun itself and the people who it hired. But in reality, I mean, you've been there, Dan, there was no distance, was there?
The U word, unlawful. Yesterday in court, on the day on which this trial should have opened, it was clear something was going on. And my expectation waking up this morning was that we'd see a settlement, and indeed that was quickly confirmed. And I think a lot of the contention will have been around the use of the word unlawful and to whom that was being attributed. You're absolutely correct to say that there was some weasel action in the words. Yes, the criminality was laid off to the 100 or so private investigators that the Sun was using. The Sun, unsurprisingly, has backtracked quite hard today. I've seen a statement that was issued to its employees in which it essentially stressed that no criminality actually at the Sun in terms of its own staff or people occurred. Okay. Well, again, you can well understand why. There was no true separation, though, in my experience, between the agents that were being used to do these things regularly and the journalists who were commissioning them. Another thing that News UK sort of said today in its statement was that in the past, all news organisations use private investigators overwhelmingly for legitimate public interest reasons. In my experience, that is misleading as a statement. The reason why PIs were used was to do things that normal citizens, normal journalists couldn't do, didn't have the knowledge or the access to databases or corrupt groups of individuals, communications companies, or wherever they might be. So, yeah, I mean, the reason why this whole sector thrives so much was that, that these services being provided were so useful because they were so illegal. Otherwise, if it was also straightforward and public interest, they would have just done it themselves.
One other aspect of this that you've mentioned was what we might call the corporate cover-up of phone hacking. Now, Andy Coulson, your former boss at the News of the World, the editor of the News of the World, was jailed effectively for commissioning phone hacking. There has been a court case in which Rebecca Brooks was found not guilty. No one, as far as I'm concerned, Dan, has ever been convicted of the corporate cover-up of these offences.
I think the corporate cover-up of these offences is what Lord Watson was referring to when he called upon Sir Mark Rowley, Commissioner of the Met Police, to investigate wrongdoing. He used the word perjury. In play now, there ought to be the evidence that's been given time and time again to various courtrooms, and indeed the Leveson inquiry back in 2011 and 12, where a parade of senior executives denied wrongdoing. Nothing to see here was the general tenor of the message. And yet the evidence has since, at the very least, even in the absence of a finding from a judge, a civil judge in this matter, definitely passes the bar of there is a case for further investigation by the criminal authorities. And so you're right to say that there's never been any accountability from the very top. The fact of cover-ups has been acknowledged by News UK in its statement, but it's talking about, its regrets around how it handled things after the 2006 arrest of Glenn Mulcair and Clive Goodman at the News of the World for hacking the royal household. So that's the open wound still, really. And what it comes down to, and it's really simple, is does the rule of law apply equally to everybody in our society? Or are there people who are untouchable? And therefore, if that is the case, is the reason they are untouchable because people are in fear of them? It's been remarkable to see that Keir Starmer very, very quickly ruled out any prospect of returning to Leveson and finishing on the promise to deliver Leveson 2, which of course would have looked at this cover-up material. And indeed, that was the appropriate forum for that to have happened. What's kind of happened since is that because politicians have been so, there's no other word, spineless on this issue, that claimants and victims have only been able to get anywhere close to the truth by going through the civil courts, through litigation. Now, the judge today, Justice Fancourt, made the point very clearly that the courts are not the appropriate place for a public inquiry, words to the effect of. They're there to decide upon disputes between individuals. And yet through this process, huge cataracts of evidence have emerged. Now, News's position today is that, well, we would have argued all of these allegations very robustly, and essentially there's no guarantee what the outcomes would have been, and therefore we stand by our denials strongly. And we're in a slightly unimpeachable position now because the judge also said this can't ever return back to trial, certainly not through the civil courts. So what's left now is essentially for the police to do their job. They're in a very difficult position, an unenviable position, because the evidence is so broad. There are so many people impacted, and the politics behind it and the politicians behind it are maybe behind closed doors have strong words, but actually, when it comes down to nailing their colours to the mast publicly, they're incredibly muted. So where does it leave us? At a real crossroads. Certainly, it brings a close to these chapters through the civil courts. Lord Watson's called for a criminal overview now. Keir Starmer's already indicated that he doesn't have any stomach for revisiting this issue in general by essentially bottling it on Leveson 2, even though he was the Director of Public Prosecutions who, way back when, 2012, I believe, was very, very keen to see police investigation into all of this.
So Leveson 2, for people who don't know, would have been looking at the connections between the press, politicians, the police, and the media. There was the notorious case, for example, of Daniel Morgan, the private investigator who was murdered. His killers have never been brought to justice. And there was evidence of collusion between police in South London and the News of the World, for example.
Yeah, Leveson 2, it would have in part with relations between the press and the police, and that would have looked into other aspects, not just the sort of passing on of corrupt money to police officers for information or to make inquiries, which they oughtn't to have been making. It also would have looked at the influence that senior news executives were able to bring on the activities and the thinking at the very top of the Met Police and elsewhere through their relationships with them through soft power. Okay, so that's a very important aspect when you consider that in the first instance, even while in possession of hard evidence showing there are at least 3,000 victims of phone hacking and even more intrusive forms of criminality discovered from the offices of Glenn Mulcair, the private investigator, whose arrest at the beginning set this whole ball rolling, actually. And I think it was August the 6th, 2006. And the police came through the door at the News of the World, having had the news desk under surveillance itself for 6 months prior to that, with wiretaps, etc., etc. And the resistance began even as they arrived at the doors at Wapping. You know, they were greeted by fairly burly porters and lawyers wanting to double check absolutely every cough and spit on their documentation and warrants. So, you know, it's been incredibly important for this soft power to be exercised. The other key point about the Leveson inquiry, part 2, is that it would have looked at who said what during the first round of evidence giving, and then you'd have been able to compare it to who said what in the criminal courts subsequently and who said what in the civil courts, and what had emerged since then through disclosure, through all these other different cases. And essentially, there were plenty of places where the evidence that were given by very senior executives, not just at News UK, but across Fleet Street, has been shown to be at best questionable and at worst completely false. Now, that is a crime. Okay, it's punishable by up to a year in jail under the Inquiries Act and vast fines. It's not even particularly difficult a bar, criminally speaking, to reach to prove it. The evidence is there. So therefore, it's a political decision as to whether or not that would ever be progressed into new trials, all of which would have flowed from Leveson 2, none of which is likely to see the light of day now, really, realistically.
Prince Harry and Tom Watson were the last claimants pursuing litigation around hacking against Murdoch publications in the UK. News Group Newspapers has settled with 1,300 people over the years. The scale of wrongdoing seems absolutely colossal.
Rupert Murdoch built his power on essentially being a legitimate looking organised crime group. That's a fact. That's why this trial couldn't go ahead from his perspective. The reality is, as a result of the way that the judge over the previous series of hearings had kind of confined the case and narrowed it down, the reality is that Prince Harry and Lord Watson, it was far from guaranteed that they were going to win. News Group could easily have gone in there, thrown all the mud in the water, and have walked away with a result. So the question is, why didn't they? They chose to pay through the nose. If the sum that you've mentioned is correct, then it is by a factor of 10 greater than any other payout that has ever been made in the British civil courts for a matter like this. Of course, all dwarfs in comparison to the sums that get paid out in the States, for example, where other criminal allegations seem to also be dogging Rupert Murdoch's companies. the Dominion case, for example.
Dominion being the vote counting machine for the US elections, which Fox News produced in various broadcasts.
Absolutely correct indeed, yeah. And the sums involved there were in the hundreds of millions. So, if a £10 million payout has indeed been agreed, then it's relatively small change to this company.
Dan, it's been great to hear from you. Thank you so much. And don't forget, you can read some of Dan's fantastic investigations in the Byline Times. And if you want to support this podcast, hear more from Dan and from others who write for the Byline Times, then please take out a subscription, support honest and fearless journalism. Head over to bylinetimes.com. That's our fantastic news-breaking website where you can take out a subscription to the Byline Times, which contains the best of our online articles and content that you can't read anywhere else. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.